Hi, everyone, and welcome to Conversations, a Women's Congress for Future Generations project. Today, we're speaking with Kaitlin Butler. Kaitlin is a senior immigration specialist in Salt Lake City, Utah. Kaitlin's work has been at the crossroads of environmental and public health, climate and intergenerational justice, decision-making in the face of environmental risk, climate change communication, and the social dimensions of climate risks. As many of you know, Kaitlin also used to work with Sen, so we're excited to check in with her and see what she's been up to. Hi, Kaitlin. Thanks for joining us.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing well.
So, catch us up. What have you been working on lately?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, hi, Sen. Hi, everyone. No secret, I used to work with all of you guys, and so I'm so thrilled and really humbled that you reached out. I am currently working in the realm of immigration law, and I work for a law firm. It is a worldwide law firm, but it's headquartered in New York. We focus on employment-based immigration law. So a lot of our work we do with the companies. We work with departments for their global mobility goals. And we also do a lot of family-based and pro bono work just by virtue of it being integral to the conversation around immigration in general. So at the surface, that's what we're up to. And then specifically within the team that I work on, I also work a lot with the kind of double-sided coin of my expertise, which is I do a lot of interpersonal relationship building, conflict resolution, client retention, and then I do a lot of our data work. So at the risk of sounding vague and mysterious, a lot of immigration work is done with paper. And our firm has been in the process of digitizing all of that work, our history of work, as well as ways of moving the work forward in this ever-changing tech environment. So I've been a huge part of the bigger project with the firm of how that digitization is rolling out.
Gotcha. So this field is a little bit different than what you were doing previously with Sen and your work environmentally there. Can you tell us a little bit about, that transition, how, I don't know, like what interested you in working in this field?
Sure. So coincidentally, this firm is a place that was my first job out of college. So I graduated back out of undergrad in 2007. And it was right before the big recession, the big crash. I had started working at this firm and was with them through that moment in history. And as a young person, this was my first serious adult job, learning how to use the fax machine, things like that, proper email etiquette, censoring my Facebook, all of that stuff happened in this space. So the person that I work for now really met me at a time in my life when I was just spreading my wings, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my degree, which had focused on, I was in sociology, but I was really interested in the dynamics that are born out of the socioeconomic histories that we carry with us. So more specifically in the US, that was a lot of stuff having to do with race relations. And how do we, what are these stories of these identity politiques? How do we talk about what is normal, what is taboo? That lended itself really nicely to being interested in the movement of humans. I had always been very interested about community, how it's built, what happens at that ground level of movement building. So all of this stuff was sort of fomenting when I was a young person, but I didn't I didn't really know what my passion, I couldn't say that I had a passion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I started at this firm, I was doing this work. It was very interesting, but I felt that I was missing something. So I was really open with my boss at the time, and had started looking around at some of the job fairs in the city. I was living in New York City at the time, and I came across this program that Columbia University was offering. It was a master's program called Climate and Society, and I was wrapped by the brochure, and then by the conversation that I had with the representative. And it was within weeks I was dropping any ideas of pursuing a law degree or law, and had pivoted sharply to letting my boss know that no, in fact, I was going to need to quit and apply to a graduate program in science. He was very supportive and very confused and sent me on my way. So, long story short, fast forward, I really felt like I had found that story that made sense to me. It was something I could lash my energy to and really apply what I felt was important to the world. So I went through this program, learning so much, and in that experience, and through a bunch of lovely humans and webs of relationships, met Carolyn Raffensperger, who equally dropped me to my knees and made me want to lash my sails to her and
Mm-hmm.
follow her wherever she went, because likewise she was able to speak to systems in a way that just resonated with me in the same way that the climate science had. So then find myself back at this immigration law firm as the job that I took after Sen is just a very lovely irony to me.
Coming back full circle.
Yes, and I think I lost track of the later part of your question, but I you'll have to remind me. But that was sort of how, the short, brief, rapid history of my job, my job resume.
Right. Well, so I guess it just kind of leaves the other question of, so you were really involved in environmental work. You were with Sen at the time of Standing Rock, and really working closely with that. So I guess my question is, in your current job, do you still feel um, fulfilled? You're not really working quite in the sphere of environment. I mean, I realize you're still working in community, um, but I guess maybe just tell us a little bit about that.
No, sure. That is such a great question. Because, with all transparency and humility to my current position, something that I have been speaking with them about is the fact that no, I am certainly not interested in positions that don't at some point consider this, not only the environment, but this bigger question and calling that I have a passion for, which is this climate change moment that we are in,
Mm-hmm.
and what we're going to do about it. Something that is ever present, and that I wish I could get more detailed on, but that I'm going to have to wait until I can see what foments out of it. But this is a conversation that I've been having with the firm. So many people who aren't familiar with climate change or climate science will hear that term, and they will think of things like environmentalism, and then they
Mm-hmm.
will immediately think of things like sustainability goals. How could we reuse, recycle, things that are part of that conversation, but not the direction or the angle that I would take it. And so
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by that, and what really came out of the work with Sen, what came out of the work with Standing Rock, and just so much that exploded out of that time, because it's not like people haven't been doing this work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like those people in Standing Rock have not been leading the charge on so many of these justice issues. But it felt to me as an observer, witnessing all of this, that there was something there were these tipping points happening, whether that was the amount of attention that the topic was getting in the media, or just the power and the leverage that a person had to speak to get a microphone in front of them. Something was happening around this shift when I was actually, sort of making this transition away from the nonprofit world into the private sector. And the decision there was strategic. It wasn't, I don't want to act like I was abandoning something and moving on to something else. My thinking was, it was a grief. It was a reckoning with the idea that for a really long time, in school and after school, I had been taught and really trained to believe that if we could figure out a way to communicate the science well, if we could, as scientists, really show up in these spaces that maybe weren't traditionally for scientists, but if we could really show up with our integrity in that moment and bring the power that science could bear to the issues at hand, that would matter. And as we began to participate in those spaces, you saw, as Standing Rock was a great example of, you saw the ways in which, number one, the science is tertiary to the things that people want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, there are the laws and the policies, and then there's the interpretations of the laws and the policies that people will follow or not. And so I felt so naive all of a sudden in the ways in which I had believed that if we did good work, good things would happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to mince my words and say that I had some naivete around like what it means to be an environmentalist and the dedication, the lifetime dedication that is. I mean, Sen is a perfect example of what that looks like when you look at the legacy of work that Ted and Carolyn have built. That is a legacy because they are still working on some of the issues that they've been working on for 20 years, and they won't stop, they won't rest. And that's what it means to be doing this work. What I mean by naivete is that I all of a sudden became very aware that I personally maybe wasn't going to be my best superhuman self. My superpowers weren't going to be able to be flexed in that space. And on the contrary, perhaps the best way I could step into the privileges I had been afforded in this lifetime would be to pivot into the spaces that I was afforded and leverage those. So I made an active decision to move to the private sector, an active decision to get back into some kind of work that felt familiar, but equally dealt with this idea of a very much interconnected system of which there are major changes happening. And, how are those things going to overlap is a huge fascination for me, and one that I want to bring to the firm that I work at now, in some capacity.
Yeah, I right before, our conversation last week, I was speaking with Megan Sheridan, and she used to work for I Matter in the nonprofit, and she actually, interestingly enough, is also working in the law field now. But she was kind of talking about these same issues, nonprofit versus private sector, and kind of, she was questioning, will she ever go back to nonprofit? Due to some other issues with nonprofits and the environmental movement as well. But she also mentioned feeling naive. And I kind of asked her, how sad is it that we're looking at things as individuals feeling naive, when really that's kind of like systemically, the problem is systemic, right? So it's not that we're naive, it's that there's a problem because the good work is not producing good results. And how we internalize that as being naive when like that's a sad development.
Mm.
And I think that that's so widespread. You think, well, I should have known better, but no, really, society should be better. um, so it's, but I, completely shared both of your sentiments on that. That's something I think about all the time. I also was just curious, thinking about the environmental field and climate change and how, they're so much obviously connected to law and the law field in general, but more specifically with climate refugees. And we're seeing a lot of, mobility needs there because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of was thinking maybe that was a bridge that
Yep.
you were seeing in your work. So.
Yep. Yep. You hit the nail on the head. And to speak to, and to kind of tie that back with your really good point about perhaps a generational difference between the role that nonprofits played, because as you pointed out so well, so much of this stuff has been borne out in real time, and the role and the power that these different sectors played is changing.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows, how all of this stuff interacts with itself. But I absolutely agree. I think that there is we are seeing a challenge to our institutions at every level.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and it's a good thing. I think institutions should be challenged. And maybe as again, as you put so well, the internalized naivete is that realization that I can't put it any other way than having a very childlike feeling like, hey, wait, the adults in the room don't even know what's going on. Like,
Right.
you guys told us there were rules, but there's no rules. Whose rules are we playing by? As Carolyn used to put so well, like, we've run the experiment, we know the outcomes. Why are we running this over and over again? Sort of this naivete, but that was coming with these questions I had that were rooted in a disappointment and an anger.
Yes.
And so how to channel that into a space that would be productive, because I was just also so angry. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I could see how that in the spaces I was in, it wasn't gonna do anybody any good, because those spaces are already fueled with emotion. So anyway, but to get to your point about the climate refugees, amazing point. Yes, natural bridge, 100%. There is a huge vacuum when it comes to the actual policies that support that definition.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, as you've seen, are having there isn't even really an overt definition for a climate refugee, but
Right.
refugees, that definition in and of itself is being now questioned by there's ways in which, as we've witnessed over time with all things policy, we would hope that we would create institutions that would allow for the rule of law to take precedent over, and really underpin our principles as a country or as a world when it comes to this stuff. But as we've seen, we haven't quite gotten there yet. And so a lot of it can be impacted by the opinions and the principles of these shorter term administrations. And like with climate, that has rippling effects. So the inability to account for the amount of people moving around the world now because of whatever reason, it doesn't even necessarily have to be negative, though you already see that there is a bunch of movement happening that we can directly tie to climate change. But there's a lot of movement anyway because of the booming technology sector, because of global corporate capitalism, because of all of these things. There is movement, and we've seen how most people cannot handle large groups of people moving at once. Like, it
Mm-hmm.
is not built into our system. We as nation states, this whole thing we've created out of the world wars, it's not built for that. And it's stressing the system. So what do we do about it? And how do those things get compounded by things like climate? You know, this is a little bit of a tangent, but what it makes me think of, and something I've been thinking about a lot, but maybe haven't formed. So I apologize if it's
No, go ahead.
nonsensical, but I have been thinking about, why is it that I am drawn to these two seemingly intractable problems, right? Like, why
Right.
are you could have been anything. Why are you going after these two worlds that, in terms of being Americentric, is the hottest topics that people love to like dig their heels into, in terms, and that a lot of that digging in is rooted in a what I'm realizing is my bigger question, which is, I think I might be more fascinated now with um, a knowledge crisis that we're having, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so this climate stuff, the immigration stuff, the movement of people, the movement of the weather, movement of all the planet that we live on, everything that Sen talks about. If we were to take a bird's eye view and really look at how we would go about, if we were the people constructing the hypothetical game, how would we go about taking account for the state we're in right now? And the first thing that comes to mind as the crisis, I don't know the crisis, if that's the right word, but that feels the most pressing, is we are no longer uh, agreeing on what is the reality of the situation. We don't have a consensus anymore around, and I'm not just talking about like what is truth versus what is not. I think I mean it, and again, why it's so ill formed, but I think I mean it more in a like, what is our, what are we going for here as humans on this planet? What's our goal? What's our bigger picture goal together?
Mm-hmm.
And as like, again, sort of naive as that sounds, it reminds me so much of the challenge that Carolyn used to put and Ted used to put into our conversations all the time, which was, yes, but what are the conditions that we are creating to make that possible?
Mm-hmm.
How, we're talking about these things we want to happen in the world. What are the conditions for that? Is the ecosystem even capable of holding that space? And I think when it comes to things like climate, immigration, the ways that we are talking about it are now so far abstracted from what is happening on like the day to day for people,
Mm-hmm.
that it feels, I don't have an answer. It's
So
quite intimidating.
this is just my thought, and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
please tell me if I'm wrong and like taking you off track. But this is something I teach grad classes here and there, and the class I'm teaching right now, one of the things that I talk about and we talk about kind of extensively is the fact that we don't want everyone to understand this knowledge. I mean, we do, you and I do, and people in the course do, and people who are doing all this good work absolutely do. But, the people who started all of these institutions and, throughout our history, they have intentionally made it very difficult to talk about the day to day because that gives people power. And
Mhm.
so it's so much easier for a small amount of people to have the power if they control the knowledge and how we're talking about things. If we're not using, any kind of like community-based or vernacular approaches to knowledge, then we are essentially keeping people under our thumbs.
Mm.
Um, and I feel like I personally, I have such a problem with the ways that we talk about science and environmentalism. And we make it so intentionally difficult for the average person just to like say what they think because they're intimidated, right? You are an incredibly knowledgeable, educated, experienced individual with these incredibly big ideas, yet you feel intimidated approaching this problem. And I think that is such a systemic thing that was really born out of an intentional effort to make it so. And there's a lot of, it's called a epistemological injustice, right? So your rights as a knower are being limited. And I think that, that's such a huge problem that we have right now, and within the greater environmental movement, including law, including everything, is a way that we're talking about all of these things, because we're not being inclusive, we're not being accessible. And so it makes it impossible to think about things on a day-to-day basis, because everything's so huge and intractable. But that's kind of how the people who have all the resources kind of want it to be, right? Because then it's easier for them. If we feel like it's so unapproachable, that's how I see it. So I don't know if you feel like along the same lines, but.
No, you gave me chills just now. Yes, 100%. And so well put. Again, to kind of go off of this, but it's a little bit of a tangent, but love sci-fi. I'm obsessed with sci-fi. And I've been recently thinking about the series Dune. And have you ever heard of the series Dune?
I have not. I'm super interested now, though.
Frank Herbert. Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm very interested in sci-fi that spans thousands of generations, thousands of years. And one of the things that Sen really introduced me to, and that started to creep up again in my mind, and trying to figure out how to embed this climate conversation into what I see as such a natural space, right? An immigration offer. And oh my gosh, of course this is going to impact our work and everybody. Yes, but figuring out a way to hold space for that and find room for that conversation, because it's not at the tip of everybody's tongue. So thinking about these things that were given to me as such big gifts from working with Sen, and getting to be mentored by those principles, which, this intergenerational justice. When you said epistemological justice, injustice, that to me speaks to this conversation that we have about rights and responsibilities to future generations. And I think a lot about how we are archiving information now. So I know we talk a lot about the future and about forecasting. We talk about that in climate a lot, and in business and the private sector and all of that. You're thinking about future changes and future growth. But in my experience with some of the work I've been doing now, and some of the work, and then observing some of the things that I've been seeing in the media, specifically around how the current administration is willing to limit that amount of knowledge that's being put into some of this climate stuff. I'll get more specific. That was a side tangent, but to finish my thought, it feels like, oh my gosh, is this intergenerational justice conversation a bigger human conversation about who has the right to history, who gets to write the history books? Isn't that always been the biggest issue? We are always constantly finding that a certain specific story was told and everything else was left out. And that because of that, we find ourselves rediscovering the exact same information over and over again, because for some reason, we as humans have not managed to take this gift we have of memory and of storytelling, and in recent times we have not figured out how to embed that with the internet and with this capacity for documentation and data and pattern finding, and store it somewhere and have a consensus about it. So I hear you. I'll leave it at that, because I'll just go on some rant, but I'm so fascinated with the injustice that you speak to as it relates to not just our futures, but our pasts. And what are we going to be actively doing today to be sure that we're coming up with some consensus around memory, especially because we're moving it all to digital.
Right.
So I do think about that a lot. And what I meant by that, the last thing I'll say is, what I meant by that random example is, I was so shocked this year, and yet it pulled out my biggest fear, which was watching a political administration, so our president, choose to limit or propose that we limit the amount of data that would be included in the climate models for the National Climate Assessment, which is something that I used to work on when I used to be a researcher after my graduate degree. They were putting in efforts to try to limit the amount of years, the decades that you would include in those projections forward, which limits the scenarios that you're building in, which limits the ways that you're looking at the different probabilities and possibilities of risk, right? It was just not talked about that much except for these circles that I still am connected with. And yet it felt like the beginnings of something horrifying, which is all of this information in terms of climate is mostly owned by the government and generated by the government and gathered by the government and stored by the government.
And that's not
right
in the public's best interest, especially now.
Right. Like you're raising up that whole idea of like, if we're talking about generational justice and how are we setting the conditions for the most possibilities for, thriving for future generations, when we're talking about things like the environment is a huge overlooked piece now going to have to be just the documentation of what was and what existed in the environment. Can we capture all of that in time? Can we have a consensus that we can agree that there are things that are being lost that we can document and memorialize? Or will we choose to go a route of rewriting I don't know. Like I said, I could go on a rant about it, but I have been thinking about this very recently because of the ways in which all of this stuff seems to be really coming all together and impacting each other. Everything feels so much more interconnected and yet huge. Like you said, just everything feels huge and intractable.
So one of the things I spoke to,
like,
no,
it was about existential crisis.
No, I mean, but that's, there's a lot, there are so many different things that I have found in actually doing this project that so many people like within, our kind of age group, and I'm a little bit younger than you are. And then I was also talking to Akila Sanders-Reed, who she works for the Power Shift Network. So she's in Minnesota and she is like a climate organizer. And so she's been fighting against Enbridge Line 3. And she was a part of the kids' climate case. Yes. And so she's younger than I am. And first of all, she has taught herself so much about the legal world because they had to, as participants in this case, they didn't have lawyers working for them. So they had to learn all of these processes by themselves. And so she is just so incredibly knowledgeable now. And one of the things that she said that I've been thinking about for a while now, and it made like every cell and fiber of my being like scream yes. It's when we talk about future generations, it's so easy to like move that needle, move that horizon further and further. Because what do we really mean when we're saying future generations? And I think it like makes it's almost like one of those ideal situations for like big companies to be like, well, future generations could mean like in 5 years, but it could mean, in like 55 years. But what she said is she'll go to all of these demonstrations and rallies, and she'll hear everyone saying, yeah, well, I'm doing this for, my kids, for future generations. And she's like, I'm doing this for my mom. Like, because the last 10 years of her life are going to be terrible if we continue to let this happen. And she's my mom. I love her. I don't want her to experience that. And I just thought that's so incredible because that is like a finite point in time. And it's not something that you can just keep pushing the needle on because our lives are not going to span forever. And I just thought, that was such an incredible way of putting that, and like of being wary of yes, we want to do the most good for future generations and preserve a livable future, but like, what are we talking about? Like how are we saying future generations and meeting future generations without allowing that term to be extremely malleable by, like big industries.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that was like such a, she has a way of like, she's very similar to you. You both are extremely articulate and concise, but quickly. Like you both speak very, very quickly and pull these ideas together so well. But I just, thought, what an incredible point. And the example that she used and the way she phrased it was so, like, it's just like a gut instinct to accept it. Like, yeah, I love my mom. Yeah, like any, I love my aunt. I love my uncle. Like that's still the same thing. And it's just such an easy sentiment to cling on to that I just thought, wow, absolutely.
Mm.
So I just thought that was an interesting thing to bring up.
I love that. I think that's so powerful.
I know.
What a sentiment. I would selfishly love to see her put that on paper, expand on that, put it on paper somehow, put it out there in the world. Maybe she has, but that is such a, as you put so well, part of this conversation is part of this conversation is being done so well by the people that are going that are the youngest ones in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the ways that I am again able to survive a day when I'm experiencing my climate grief in its most tangible, visceral forms, I often will try to seek out a younger person, out of our Children's Trust or Greta or Sen's work, your work, younger people, what are they up to? Because, and it's not out of some romanticization of what are the young kids doing. It is because they are the only ones in the room that can hold the space necessary, the maturity and the intellect necessary for this conversation. I feel that truly. I don't even include myself in that category. I have been floored by some of the ways that people younger than me are stepping into the burden that they have to bear, that they have been just without consent given. And I'm